Thank you, Roy. And thank you for inviting me here again. Somebody stuffed up. After all, how was I to know this was going to be an unofficial back to Midway Point weekend? Because I don't come from Midway Point. I come from Queensland. It's a different place altogether. There you're talking about the promised land.
Well, we've got a heap of Queensland. They're from everywhere.
So someone made a mistake somewhere along the line. Never mind. Today I'm going to do something a little bit different. I'm going to look at one of the famous Bible stories of old that you learned as a kid, very possibly. Don't you ever tell me that Bible stories are old hat and boring. They're full of life and excitement. Oh, they mightn't have the magic and the murder and mayhem of the fictional Harry Potter, but these are true stories about real people who did amazing things. And Daniel, one of the central characters in today's story, was one of those amazing people from years gone by. And his story is found in the Bible book that bears his name, and that, of course, is in the Old Testament. Now, I'm not going to read the whole story to you. I'm going to tell you the story as we go along. And if we wanted a verse that could sum up what the story is all about, I'd use Romans 8:31, where it says, "What then? If God is for us, who can be against us?" Who was this Daniel, and where did he come from? As a young Hebrew teenager, he lived in Jerusalem, is now what is called Israel. At least he did, until about 605 BC, when King Nebuchadnezzar swept in with his armies and captured the whole country, and marched Daniel and many other captives back to his home city of Babylon, some 900 kilometers away. That's equivalent to getting up off here, walking out to the Midland Highway, up to the top, right across to Stanley, turning around and coming back and all the way back to Midway Point, and turning around and going back up as far as Campbelltown. Now, you're not going to do that in a day or two, are you? It's going to take a little while. And over the next few years, Daniel and his friends were trained in all the wisdom and the ways of their new country, Babylon. And because of his wisdom, his upright character, and God-given abilities, Daniel was placed in a high position of government there in Babylon. You imagine what life would have been like serving under a maniac of a king, who erected a huge statue of himself and ordered everyone to bow down and worship him, on the threat of death if they didn't do it. Would you have had the guts to defy the king and say no? Daniel's friends did just that. And they endured going through the fiery furnace. It would have been a real testing time for them. Eventually, Nebuchadnezzar was replaced on the throne by his son, King Belshazzar. And again, Daniel served in a high position under him. Daniel's God-given ability to interpret dreams was a valuable tool for all the kings under which he served. One day, Belshazzar held a huge drunken orgy in his palace, and he dared to use the golden goblets that Nebuchadnezzar had stolen from the temple in Jerusalem. He got the fright of his life, and Daniel was called in to interpret the mysterious writing that appeared on the wall. And Daniel explained to the king that God had judged him and that he would die that very night. And that's exactly what happened. So at last we get to today's story. Daniel. That leads a little bit better. Daniel in the lion's den. The armies of the two combined countries, the Medes and the Persians, swept in that very night and conquered Babylon and the whole Babylonian Empire and put King Belshazzar to death, just as Daniel had foretold. Very quickly, they extended their dominion over almost all the Old Testament world. Now, Daniel, for the third time since arriving in Babylon, had to work with a new king. And Darius was the name of the king. Well, I call him Darius. Some people say Darius. Whichever. You know who I mean. I'll stick to the one I knew as a kid. The king, Darius, had chosen over 100 satraps or princes to help him govern the people, and they were answerable to the 3 administrators the king appointed over them. When we first met Daniel in Jerusalem, he was just a teenager. But God's prophet had prophesied years before that the Hebrews would spend 70 years there in captivity. So at the time of our story, many of those years have passed, and Daniel is almost certainly now a man in his mid-80s. He's not the young man that he used to be, like all of us. Daniel, because of his great wisdom and upright character, was a favourite of the king, and he was given the place of authority over the other 2 administrators. Everyone was answerable to Daniel. Only the king could tell Daniel what to do. I think corruption was just as bad in those days as it is now. He found an honest man who would look after his affairs. So the princes, because of Daniel's position with the kingdom, the other princes resented him. Jealousy made them bitter, and they plotted to get rid of Daniel. If Daniel were out of the way, one of them could be put in his place. So the princes started to spy on Daniel. They watched every move that Daniel made. They were hoping their leader would do something wrong so they could run and tell the king to get rid of him. So let me ask you a question. Who's watching you today? In these days of technology, we might all be surprised just who is watching us. Perhaps more than we even realise. There are security cameras in most stores, and as you shop, people are watching you. Many roads have CCTV cameras that take pictures of cars and people moving past all day long. Credit card companies are watching what you buy and where you buy it. Phone companies can watch who you're calling, who's calling you, and where you are at the time. And you'll never know how closely you're being watched as you surf the internet. But way, way above all that, the important thing is that God is watching you. Proverbs 15:3 says, "The eyes of the Lord are everywhere, keeping watch on the wicked and the good." And as David wrote Psalm 139, he said, "You know when I sit down and when I get up. You know my thoughts from far away. You know where I go and where I lie down. You know everything I do. Lord, you know what I want to say, even before the words leave my mouth. You're all around me, in front of me and behind me. I feel your hand on my shoulder. I am amazed at what you know. It is too much for me to understand." It's a comforting thing to know that God is keeping his eye on us, and to know that he sees and understands everything we do and say and think. It's a scary thought, and one that should be sobering to all of us. And apart from God, then there's the devil who's keeping a close eye on you too. In 1 Peter 5:8 we read, "Control yourselves and be careful. The devil is your enemy, and he goes around like a roaring lion looking for someone to attack and eat." Now, I don't believe he has the same power as God to see everything that goes on inside us. But there is a spiritual battle going on all around us every day, but we don't see it, and so often we forget it and ignore it. But that battle is going on because the devil is watching you to trip you up every way that you go. And then we could say also that everyone's watching you. If you call yourself a Christian, then lots of people are watching you every day to see if what you say agrees with what you do. And then if we want to know how we should act, look at Matthew 5:14. It says, "You are the light of the world. Let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and realize what a wonderful person you are." Oh, no, it doesn't say that, does it? "That they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven." So the world is watching us in everything that we do, as they were watching Daniel. But Daniel was a good man. Day after day, Daniel lived as the Lord would have him live, and 3 times a day he went down on his knees to pray to God. There were no skeletons in Daniel's closet that he was ashamed of. Even Daniel's enemies couldn't find any dirt on him, and the princes were greatly disappointed that they could find nothing wrong with Daniel's conduct. This is how the Bible records it in Daniel 6 and 4. At this, the administrators and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel and his conduct in government affairs, but they were unable to do so. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. And if we summed it up, we could say that he was faithful in his duties, he was faultless in his character, and he was fervent in his prayers. Does that describe you? I don't think I could live up to that. That's a very, very high standard. Those are three marks of godliness that even unbelievers can see. The people who watch you can tell if you work hard at your job, at your studies. They know what kind of character you have. If they watch long enough, they'll learn whether you're a person who believes in prayer. Whatever's in your heart will eventually come out. And people who don't know the Lord will know the truth about you. In Daniel's case, even his enemies had to admit he had no glaring weaknesses. What a guy. Spying on Daniel was proving to be a waste of time. To rob this man of his position and authority, the princes knew they must think of a plan that would trick Daniel into disobeying the king. And it wasn't long before they come up. The Bible said, these men said, we will never find any basis for charges against this man Daniel, unless it has something to do with the law of his God. So they came up with a devious idea, and the princes gathered together outside the palace and asked for permission to see the king. And the king was surprised when he heard the request. Such a thing was not normally done. Normally the princes only came together by royal decree. Still, the king was curious. What was it the princes wanted? It must be very important, thought the king, otherwise the princes would never dare to ask for such a thing. So the king gave them permission to come before him, and the one who had been chosen to speak for the group stepped forward with the usual greeting, "O King Darius, live forever." And then he went on to tell the king that all the princes of the kingdom were anxious that a new law be made as a special honour to our beloved ruler. You can almost hear the sarcasm in the way he's putting it across. The law went on to say, as he explained to the king, that no one throughout the kingdom is to ask anything of anyone, God or man, for the next 30 days, unless they ask you, O king. And if anyone breaks the law, they're to be thrown into the den of lions. King Darius was flattered by such a request. Didn't even occur to him that Daniel might have been left out of the planning. After all, they'd said, all the princes of the kingdom have decided this together. So he signed their decree and made it a law. He was a high official in the government. It wasn't long before Daniel heard about the law, and he knew in his heart that this was a trap that had been set just for him. Daniel knew the next time he got down on his knees before his open window to ask God for divine guidance and continued blessing, the men who plotted this thing would report him to the king. But Daniel's got a problem. He could have closed his window, prayed to God in secret, but Daniel knew that to do such a thing would be cowardly. He knew that regardless of whatever happened to him, he must obey God's will in his life. So Daniel continued to pray before his open window, just as he'd done before. One thing about Daniel, he was always so predictable. And that's not such a bad habit to have. Daniel 6 and 10 tells us, now when Daniel learned the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room, where his windows opened toward Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before. Note that last phrase, just as he'd done before. For perhaps 85 years, Daniel had prayed 3 times a day. Could have been 7 in the morning, middle of the day, 5 in the afternoon, who cares? 3 times a day. And each day was always the same. Wherever he was, he stopped to pray at these times. Like clockwork, his daily routine revolved around his times of prayer. Ask yourself, how many times would Daniel have prayed if he prayed 3 times a day for 85 years? I'm not any mathematician working it out. It's over 93,000 times anyway, if you want to have it. No wonder he simply went back to his room and started praying. An 85-year habit is pretty hard to break. For him, prayer was like breathing. It was just as important. He wasn't about to stop praying just because those snot-nosed satraps threatened his life. No way. After all, he was 85 or thereabouts, and he knew he wasn't going to live forever. And he wasn't afraid to die. So when they tricked Darius into signing the 30-day law, Daniel just went ahead with his daily routine. No big deal. He went home, knelt down, faced towards Jerusalem and offered his prayers to God. And he did it, knowing his adversaries would catch him. Would we have been brave enough? Remember who Daniel was? He was one of the top 3 men in the Medo-Persian Empire. No doubt he had a heavy load of responsibility, yet he organised those responsibilities to fit around his prayer times each day. To him, his prayer times were the most important times of the day. He was a few generations before, but he'd agree with the word of Oswald Chambers, who once said, "Prayer does not equip us for greater works. Prayer is the greater work." It's a thought. In case you think it's a small thing to pray 3 times a day, think about this. Let's assume there were 20 people who come to this church every week. Suppose that each of us decide to pray 3 times a day. That would be nearly 22,000 prayers offered to God every year. And if that were to happen, possibly we could see some more remarkable answers from God. So let me ask you, how important is prayer in your life? Well, it's so important it's mentioned over 250 times in Scripture. So why is daily prayer important? Well, for one reason is that prayer brings you closer to God. Our prayer time is our time alone with God, with the Creator, the Almighty. And as we learn from Him and talk to Him and He talks to us, our prayer strengthens our relationship with Him so that He can be reflected in every other part of our lives. Then too, prayer brings divine help and guidance. God is everywhere, and of course He knows us and He knows what we need. But He wants us from time to time to come to Him, tell Him what we need, and ask for His guidance and blessing. We can pray that others too could receive the help they need as well. Prayer can help us gain forgiveness. When we pray, we open ourselves up to forgiveness. We all, and I say all, slip up. We sin from time to time. And when we do, it's then we need to come to God in prayer, to confess our wrongs, to ask for forgiveness, and ask for help to forgive others. And prayer gives us strength. God provides us with a great deal of strength as we rely on Him through prayer. It helps us to know as we understand more and more that He's there, He's with us, He's beside us. And He's not just another person, He's the Almighty God, the one of all power. He can give us strength. And prayer offers us hope. When we get down in the dumps, as we do from time to time, prayer gives us hope. If we learn to bring our problems to God's feet and leave them there, it opens us up to trusting Him and leaving the problems with Him and not going away and worrying about it. Having hope doesn't always mean that things will turn out the way we want them to, but it can mean that things will turn out the way God wants them to, which is the best way. And this was the moment the princes were waiting for. Daniel was seen breaking the law. And according to the signed decree, Daniel must be thrown to the lions. When the princes went to the king and demanded that Daniel be thrown to the lions, King Darius realized for the first time that he'd been tricked. This was no law to honor their king, but an evil plot to get rid of Daniel. King Darius was very fond of Daniel. He considered Daniel a trustworthy friend, and he greatly relied on the judgment of this wise man. But the king was trapped. According to the law, Daniel must die. King Darius dismissed the princes and spent the rest of the day searching through the laws, hoping to find a way he could save his friend, but the law was clear. Once the king had signed the decree, not even the king himself could undo what he had done. That was the law in those days. And with the setting of the sun, the king was forced reluctantly to command that Daniel be seized and taken to the place where the lions were kept. The animals were crazy with hunger, and whatever was thrown to them was normally instantly torn to pieces. The king took Daniel aside and told him how sorry he was at having been trapped into doing this, and how, according to the law, not even he could revoke a royal decree. Perhaps there was a glimmer of doubt in his mind, where he said, "May your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you." And then Daniel was thrown to the lions. And a great stone was brought and placed over the hole, and the seal of the king was placed on the stone, so that no one would dare to remove it. And slowly and sadly, the king returned to his palace with a very heavy heart. All night long the king tossed and turned on his bed, and as he thought about Daniel, his mind told him that Daniel must have known about the law, and yet Daniel continued to pray. Was he just stupid? Or was it even possible that this God that he served so faithfully would save him from the lions? When the rays of the morning sun told King Darius that his night of despair was over, the queen hurriedly dressed himself and ran to the place where the lions were kept, and ordered the stone to be taken away. The stone was taken away, and the king cried out, "Daniel, servant of the living God, is your God able to deliver you from the lions?" He listened intently, hoping to hear the voice of his friend. And then to his delight he heard the voice that said, "O king, live forever. My God has sent his angel and has shut the lions' mouths. They have not hurt me. God found me innocent before him and also before you, O king." Oh, the king was so happy to hear the voice of Daniel, he commanded his friend be taken out of the lion's den at once. The king made a further command that the wicked princes, the men who had plotted against Daniel, be thrown to the lions in Daniel's place. It's an important lesson to learn. There are always consequences to bad behavior. And those consequences can impact upon others. Well, Daniel 6:24 says, "At the king's command, the men who had falsely accused Daniel were brought in and thrown into the lion's den along with their wives and children." To us that seems hard, that these innocent ones should suffer because of the wrongs of their relatives. But it reminds us of the seriousness of sin in God's sight, and it's a wake-up call for all of us. And just as the story ends badly for Daniel's accusers, so it will for those who accuse and persecute Christians today. But what a change in King Darius. He immediately signed a new law. And this law reflected the new understanding he had now of the God of Daniel. Darius came to realize that Daniel served a powerful God who could do amazing things and who lives to get forever. And he issued a decree, and the decree says, "I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. What a decree from a pagan king. Absolutely stunning. It shows what an impact a godly life can have even on those who have no knowledge of God. Somehow King Darius recognized the power of the God of Daniel and apparently turned to him in some degree of faith and commanded that the people in his kingdom that they must also worship this God. Through the witness of Daniel, his faith, and the faithfulness and power of God, an entire nation came to know and reverence the Lord. Godly lives can bring about change in people who don't know God. And I know that from personal experience. Many, many years ago, when I first started work, I started work in an engineering office in the Queensland government. And because we were the principal designer of bridges, we had a lot to do in those days with the then Professor of Civil Engineering at UQ. He was often apparently in the office prior to my getting there, but I'm a little fellow those days. He often came in. He had written excellent books on bridge design, and every engineer in the office had them as their Bible to work from as far as bridge design was concerned. And obviously there were many reports that had to be written. And the engineers didn't type up reports in those days. We had a typing pool. You remember typewriters? Some of us do. And there were 3 girls in our office, and there was obviously one that he always worked with who did his reports after meeting with the engineers in my office. Well, I don't know how it happened, but the Professor of Civil Engineering got to like this young girl. He must have taken her out. And to shorten the story, he eventually married this young typist. But not before this humble typist from the typing pool had led the Professor of Civil Engineering to the Lord. And I know him personally. He came to our assembly for many years, and his ministry from that brilliant mind, from the Word of God, was something that was great. So godly lives can bring about change in people who don't know God. So what do we learn from this story of Daniel? We learn about faith. Faith believes God even when things seem impossible. It certainly seemed impossible for Daniel that he would escape in that situation. But Daniel 6:23 says, when Daniel was lifted from the dead, no wound was found on him because he had trusted in his God. You know what it's like to trust in God? You know what it's like to put your faith in a God who is almighty, who has power that you can't even imagine. It can change your life. It will change your life. So we learn that faith believes God, even when things seem impossible. We can read too and understand too from this story that God is able to deliver his people from danger. If God can deliver Daniel from the lion's den, he can surely deliver you from your circumstances. Generations of Christians have taken their strength from this story because in it, the hero isn't Daniel. It's Daniel's God. That same God is sovereign over those who are plotting against you. And he's sovereign over whatever lions might be surrounding you right now. Take heart and trust in God as Daniel did. He can deliver you from whatever is troubling you at this moment, but remember, God delivers in his own time and his own way. And that's the necessary balance to keep in mind. Can God always deliver his people? Yes, of course he can. But not always in the way we expect. Not all our prayers are answered in the way we want them to be. I found out when my wife was going down with breast cancer, obviously prayed time and time again that God would deliver her from the pain and the suffering that she was going through. And He did, but not quite in the way I would have liked. He took her home to the glory, where there is no more pain and no more suffering. He knew the best way to do it. God has veto power over our fervent prayers. Sometimes God overrules because He sees the bigger picture and knows He can glorify Himself in some way other than by delivering us from a difficult situation. And if God should choose to answer in that way, we can say no more than what King Nebuchadnezzar said way back there in Daniel 4:37. Everything God does is right. And then we can learn also, God can use us to influence others no matter our age. As a young man and right through his life, Daniel was a great influence on many, many people. He formed and directed the affairs of nations. God used him because of his faith in God. Just to round it up, in my studies for this, I came across a daily Bible study presented by the University Press, and I liked it so much I just put it in here to read as it is. If you read the book of Daniel and only see a den of lions and some strange visions, you miss the main character in the book, a sovereign God. Daniel wrote this book not to glorify himself, but to exalt the Lord. In every circumstance, in every crisis, Daniel points us to a God who is sovereignly at work in human history. To say that God is sovereign means simply that nothing happens that is not planned or permitted by God. That's true of kingdoms, and it's also true in our lives. Daniel's God is not a weak, frustrated deity who sits in heaven wringing his hands, hoping that everything's going to turn out all right. He is a God who orders events in this world according to his own will. The book of Daniel is designed to speak to us in those times when God seems to be absent. The crushed, captive people of Israel in Daniel's day were saying, "Where's God? Why doesn't he answer?" And Daniel answers their questions by showing that even in a national catastrophe, God is working out his plan and purpose. Daniel is able to resist compromise because of his relationship to a sovereign God. His obedience was simply an expression of God's kingship in his life. Daniel's courage to proclaim God's message came from his allegiance to a sovereign God. He saw the Lord as one who was king over his life, as well as over the earthly kings of Babylon and those that he served. The question is, are we prepared to allow a sovereign God to be king over our lives? Are we prepared to put our faith and our trust in him day by day? May it be that the Lord will speak to us in these few words and realize that great things can happen if we put our trust. And I found an old hymn in this book, number 514. And we'll conclude with that, and I'll hand it over back to Roy to wrap things up and then to pray. This is an old hymn that used to be sung in Sunday school years ago. Standing by a purpose true, following God's command. Honour them, the faithful few who march into Daniel's band. And do you dare to be a Daniel? You dare to stand alone? You dare to have a purpose firm? And you dare to make it known? I wonder, as we think again of the story of Daniel, how it will affect our lives. Let's stand and sing it together, please.